They called her the Dragon Lady, a shadow behind the silk curtains of China's forbidden city. She entered the palace as nothing, just another trembling teenage concubine, one of hundreds meant to please the Son of Heaven. Her name was Cixi, and in a world ruled by men, she learned quickly you survive by smiling, bowing, and listening. And you rule by knowing when to stop smiling, when to stop bowing, and when to silence those who think you should only listen. Behind the red lacquered walls, China was crumbling. Famines turned rivers into graveyards. Rebellion set provinces on fire. Foreign cannons shattered the illusion of imperial power. But inside the forbidden city, the Empress Dowager moved through incense. Scented halls draped in embroidered silk, her fingers heavy with jade rings, her face painted in powder, her eyes always watching. They whispered about poison cups and silken newses in the night. They whispered about how one emperor died, and another disappeared, while the woman behind the screen remained, unbending and unmoved. She ruled from the shadows, ruling a dying empire with an iron will, and a taste for luxury as the Qing dynasty bled out under her watch. This is the story of Cixi, the concubine who became the most powerful woman in China, leaving a trail of dead emperors and shattered reforms in her wake. A woman who rose from nothing to everything, and who would rather let an empire rot than surrender her power. Because history is dark, and she was one of its darkest rulers. She was born in 1835, in the shadows of a crumbling empire, under the uneasy hush of a Manchu household that could feel the tides of China turning. Her father, a low-ranking official in the Manchu Eight Banners, lived with modest means, enough for warm rice bowls and thin walls, but never enough to offer the promise of a life that reached beyond the confines of their dusty home. Her name was Yehanara, a name that would one day echo through marble halls in fear. But in that moment, it belonged to a girl who learned early that silence was safer than hope. Childhood for Yehanara was a collection of lessons stitched into her mind with the cold needle of tradition. Bow your head. Don't speak unless spoken to. And never forget your place. Her mother taught her to embroider, to fold her hands, but to lower her eyes. But behind that lowered gaze, a sharpness was forming. A quiet study of the world, of people's weaknesses, of when to smile, and when to hide that smile beneath the mask of obedience. In 1851, when she was 16, the walls of her family home became too small to contain her future, and her name was called in the selection for imperial concubines. A lottery where beauty could buy survival, and survival might one day buy power. She was sent to the forbidden city, through the towering red gates that swallowed girls and turned them into shadows. There, she became just another flower in a garden of hundreds, each girl competing for the wandering gaze of a man they might never even see. The forbidden city was not a palace, it was a gilded prison. Inside, the hierarchy was a suffocating labyrinth, where each concubine's rank was determined by the emperor's passing interest, and the difference between a smile and a glance could mean the difference between life and death. They lived in quiet terror of the older consorts and the higher-ranking concubines, who ruled their small dormitories with iron claws, painted in lacquer. Rivalries brewed like poison in porcelain cups. Alliances were formed in whispers behind silk screens, and every gesture, every word, was a test of survival. Yehanara was given the title of Noble Lady Lan, a low rank, but it was a foot in the door of power. A door that slammed shut on many girls and left them to rot in loneliness within the painted walls. The forbidden city was not silent. It was alive with secrets, the soft shuffle of slippers in the night, the quiet weeping of girls who would never see their families again, the desperate laughter of those who tried to claw their way up the hierarchy by betraying others. The concubines were dressed in the finest silks and adorned with jewels, but beneath those layers, their bodies and minds were bruised with the weight of endless waiting. Waiting for a chance to be noticed, for a pregnancy that would grant them status, for the emperor's gaze to land on them and change their fate. Emperor Xianfeng, the man whose attention could lift a girl from nothing to power, was a man swallowed by his own empire's decay. China was fracturing under internal rebellions and external humiliations, the opium crisis bleeding the country of its dignity. But within the walls of the Forbidden City, the emperor retreated into opium smoke and fleeting pleasures, leaving a court swirling with corruption and uncertainty. And it was here, in this nest of fear, desire, and ambition, that Yehanara learned to watch. She learned to smile at the right people, to bow deeply, to let others underestimate her, and to wait. She learned that in the Forbidden City, patience was deadlier than a dagger, and that silence could be a blade sharper than any sword. In 1856, the game changed forever. Yehanara did what many concubines prayed for, in tearful whispers each night. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son, Zaichun, the emperor's only surviving male heir, in a palace where the emperor's affection was fickle, and where beauty faded quickly under the strain of court politics. Giving birth to a son was the only true currency of power a woman could possess. From the moment Zaichun drew his first breath, Yehanara's position shifted. No longer a low-ranking concubine, she became Consort Yi, the mother of the heir to the dragon throne. The other concubines who had once dismissed her now watched her with envy and fear, for in the Forbidden City, the mother of the emperor's son became a dangerous woman, a woman whose words carried weight, whose alliances mattered, and whose survival became vital to the entire dynasty. But power came wrapped in the same silk as danger. Poison was a frequent visitor in the Forbidden City, and a child who was heir to the empire was both a treasure and a target. Yehanara watched her son with the eyes of a hawk, trusting no one, for she knew that her life and his were tied together. If he lived, she would rise. If he died, she would fall, and in the Forbidden City, falling often meant never rising again. Emperor Xianfeng, meanwhile, was deteriorating rapidly. The empire was splintering under the strain of the Taiping Rebellion, which turned provinces into charred wastelands. The British and French were pushing their way into China, humiliating the Qing court, and forcing opium down the throats of its people. In the midst of this chaos, Xianfeng retreated further into his opium pipe, letting smoke cloud his mind as the empire burned around him. He was young, but his body was giving way, poisoned by the very substance that was killing his nation. As Xianfeng's health declined, the political vacuum within the court deepened. Corrupt officials feasted on the dying empire, factions warred in whispers and bribes, and Yehanara, now Consort Yi, understood that if she wanted to survive, she would need to seize every opportunity. The emperor's failing health was both a threat and a promise. His death would leave a child emperor on the throne, a throne that would require a regent, and in the Forbidden City, power did not wait for invitations. Yehanara began to maneuver with a patience that was both terrifying and brilliant. She forged quiet alliances with those who shared her vision, or who were desperate enough to cling to her rising star. She studied the court's weaknesses, memorized the ambitions of the men around her, and learned the art of appearing docile while quietly pulling threads that would one day tighten around the necks of her enemies. The birth of Zaichun was the hinge upon which her destiny turned, but it was Yehanara's mind that would transform that chance into dominance. She was no longer the trembling girl who entered the Forbidden City. She was now a mother with the future of an empire wrapped in her child's small, fragile hands, and she would not let that future slip away. As the emperor lay dying, the Forbidden City hummed with fear, the kind that settled like a sickness in the lungs of every official and servant who felt the change in the air. Power was shifting. The old order was cracking, and Yehanara, Consort Yi, stood at the center of that, silent, watchful, and ready. Because in the Forbidden City, where emperors died and concubines vanished without a trace, Yehanara was learning the most important lesson of all power is not given. It is taken. In 1861, the Forbidden City's air grew heavier than usual, thick with the scent of incense and fear. Emperor Xianfeng, the son of heaven, lay dying far from Beijing, tucked away in the distant Jihold's summer retreat. Hiding from the foreign powers who had humiliated China and forced open her gates with cannon fire and treaties signed in blood. His opium-clouded mind flickered in and out of lucidity, the once proud ruler now a husk, his body wasting away under silk covers as eunuchs whispered prayers into the stagnant air. Outside, the Qing dynasty was crumbling. The Taiping rebellion still raged, tearing provinces apart, leaving rivers clogged with bloated corpses and villages smouldering under grey skies. The British and French had burned the old summer palace to the ground, a palace of treasures turned to ash in a single season of humiliation. China was bleeding, its ancient dignity mocked by Western guns, its court paralyzed by corruption, and the emperor was dying, unable to hold the empire together. In the midst of this collapse, a 5-year-old boy, Zai Chun, held the fragile thread of the dynasty's future in his tiny hands. The emperor's only surviving son. The child was too young to even understand the weight placed upon his small shoulders. But there was one person who understood the weight very well. His mother, Consort Yi, now Empress Dowager Cixi. When Xianfeng finally exhaled his last breath in August 1861, the empire was left in the hands of a child, and a regency council of 8, appointed by the emperor on his deathbed, to guide the boy. 8 powerful men, each with their own ambitions, each believing that the mother of the child emperor would remain in her place, silent and obedient, behind her veils and silks. But they had underestimated the woman, who had survived the knives of the Forbidden City, who had learned to read the ambitions of men in the slight twitch of a brow, who had mastered the art of smiling while planning the downfall of those who stood in her way. They had underestimated Cixi. She returned to Beijing with the body of the dead emperor, the young boy, emperor in tow, her face hidden beneath layers of mourning white, but behind that mask, her mind was alive, calculating. The regents immediately attempted to sideline her, issuing edicts in the young emperor's name, without her approval, ignoring her position, refusing to grant her power. Cixi saw them for what they were, obstacles. She began to move quietly, weaving a web of alliances in the suffocating corridors of the Forbidden City. She reached out to Empress Dowager Cixi, the principal widow of Xianfeng, a gentle and cautious woman who had little taste for politics but whose signature was necessary on imperial decrees. Cixi spoke softly to Xian, offering assurances, framing herself as a loyal protector of the dynasty and the young emperor, convincing her that the regents threatened the throne itself. Outside the Forbidden City, Cixi reached for another key player. Prince Gong, the emperor's brother, a man known for his sharp mind and ambition. Prince Gong had been humiliated by the regents after he negotiated with the British and French during the burning of the Summer Palace. But he still held sway with the military and the progressive factions within the court. Cixi promised him power, restoration of his honor, and a role in guiding China out of its nightmare. Together, they formed an alliance that would shake the empire. In the cold dawn of November 2, 1861, the Forbidden City, a labyrinth of red walls and silence, became the stage for a quiet but decisive coup, the Sinew Coup. As the regents prepared for the day, soldiers loyal to Prince Gong moved through the streets and alleys of Beijing, their boots crunching on frost-covered stones, closing off exits, securing gates, and tightening the noose around the regents, who still believed themselves safe within their layers of power. Inside the Forbidden City, Cixi and Xian issued a decree in the young emperor's name, stripping the regents of their titles and powers, accusing them of corruption and incompetence, of failing to protect the empire. The regents, shocked and scrambling, found themselves alone, abandoned by their supporters, surrounded by soldiers, and cut off from the networks of influence they believed would save them. Arrests were swift. The regents were dragged from their homes, their cries echoing through the halls that had once bowed before them. They were paraded through the streets in chains, their silken robes dragging through the dust, the people of Beijing watching in silence as power shifted before their eyes. Punishments were swift and brutal. Sushan, the most powerful of the regents, was executed by beheading, his head displayed as a warning to others who might think to challenge the will of the Empress Dowager. Others were forced to commit suicide, swallowing poison in their prison cells, their deaths quiet, unmarked, erased from history by the will of a woman who had learned that in order to rule, mercy was a luxury she could not afford. With the regents dead or disgraced, Cixi emerged from the shadows, not as a concubine, not as a silent mother, but as Empress Dowager and co-regent of China, ruling in the name of her young son, alongside Empress Dowager Cixi. She now sat behind the silk screen during court meetings, her eyes sharp, her presence undeniable, her power absolute. The Xinyu coup was not just the seizure of power, it was the declaration of a new era within the Qing court. An era where Cixi, who had entered the Forbidden City as a trembling girl, now held the empire in her hands, shaping its future with every whispered word and every stroke of her calligraphy brush. And the empire would learn, often in blood, that she would not be denied. When the morning court convened within the crimson walls of the Forbidden City, ministers in heavy silk robes shuffled in silence, clutching memorials written on bamboo paper, their hearts pounding beneath their layers of official dignity. They would bow low, the scent of incense and cold stone filling their noses, and raise their heads only to see a silk screen at the head of the hall. Behind that screen sat Empress Dowager Cixi. They could not see her face, but they could feel her gaze, sharp as the edge of a dagger, sweeping over them as they recited their reports. The rustle of her robes, the soft clack of jade bracelets against each other as she shifted her hands. These tiny sounds became the heartbeat of the court, reminders that every word spoken could either secure their careers or seal their deaths. Cixi had mastered the art of ruling without appearing to rule. She was technically not the emperor. She was, merely, the Empress Dowager, the mother of the young emperor, ruling as regent until he came of age. But in the Forbidden City, technicalities meant nothing when power was enforced with quiet ruthlessness. Behind the screen, she listened. She learned the weaknesses of each minister, which ones flinched when challenged, which ones hesitated before answering, which ones glanced nervously at their rivals. She learned to sort them in her mind: the useful, the corrupt but controllable, the dangerous, the expendable. Her political instincts were sharper than any blade, and she wielded them with the precision of a surgeon cutting away infection to keep the body alive. Except the infection was often those who dared to oppose her. She manipulated the factions of the Qing court like a master puppeteer, setting rival cliques against each other so they would exhaust themselves while she remained untouched, floating above the chaos. Those who proved their loyalty were rewarded with promotions, gifts, and positions that allowed them to taste power, but never so much that they might challenge her. Those who betrayed her, or who she suspected might betray her, were dealt with quietly, sometimes publicly, and always effectively. While the Forbidden City's lacquered halls appeared serene, beneath the surface, fear flowed like a hidden river. Ministers learned to speak carefully, to praise the Empress Dowager's wisdom, even when disagreeing with her policies, to watch their backs in the dark corridors after court was dismissed. Whispers of dissent were reported by eunuchs, who owed their survival to Cixi and repaid her in secrets. A single sentence spoken carelessly could find its way back to her ears. and the consequences could be immediate and irreversible. Cixi, behind her silk screen, did not need to raise her voice to command the empire. She merely had to nod. They called her the Dragon Lady for a reason. In the Forbidden City, power was not simply taken. It was secured, over and over, in blood and fear. Cixi understood this with chilling clarity. Rumors swirled through the red halls, like winter wind's whispers of poisoned cups. Silken cords slipped around throats in the dark. Sudden illnesses that left even the healthiest officials gasping their last on the cold stone floors of their chambers. Enemies disappeared, sometimes with a cup of poisoned tea. Some of these stories were true, some were not. But Cixi understood that in the politics of fear, it didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed them. One court official, who dared to oppose her consolidation of power, was found dead in his bed, his face twisted in agony, the teacup he had sipped from still warm beside him. Another minister, who had been loudly critical of her interference in the court's decisions, suddenly fell ill after a banquet. His lips blackened before he died. Was it poison? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was fear itself, tightening around the heart, killing him before the poison could. Cixi's harsh punishments became lessons to the court. She did not tolerate those who challenged her authority, and she made it clear that even a hint of disobedience could result in ruin. Families of traitors could lose their wealth, titles stripped away, homes confiscated, leaving widows and children begging in the streets of Beijing. Reminders to others that crossing the Empress, Dowager, meant the destruction of generations. Rumors even clung to her relationship with her own son, the Tongji Emperor. When he came of age, he attempted to assert his independence, seeking to rule without his mother's constant guidance. He resented her control, resented the way she overshadowed him, and there were whispers that he planned to remove her influence from court. In 1875, he died suddenly at the age of 19. The official cause was smallpox, but the court's whispers suggested other possibilities. Some said it was syphilis, contracted in the brothels of Beijing during his attempts to escape his mother's grasp. Others claimed it was poison, a silken act of mercy, or silencing, by the woman who had raised him under the weight of imperial expectation. Cixi, they said, wept at his funeral, dressed in mourning white, her face hidden behind her veil. But her tears did not stop her from ensuring that the next emperor would also be a child she could control. Her 3-year-old nephew, Guangxu, who would be enthroned under her watchful eye, continuing her grip on the empire. The Forbidden City remained beautiful, a labyrinth of painted dragons and golden tiles, but behind its gates, it was a place of fear, of quiet weeping in the night, of footsteps in the dark outside your door, and of teacups that might be your last. And at the center of this empire of whispers and fear sat Empress Dowager Cixi, behind her silk screen, watching, listening, waiting, because she knew that in the end, power was not about titles, ceremonies, or even armies. It was about control, and Cixi controlled everything. In 1875, a chill settled over the Forbidden City that had nothing to do with the winter winds that swept across the marble courtyards. Behind the red walls and golden roofs, beneath the dragon carvings and incense smoke, a mother prepared to bury her son, the Emperor of China, dead at the age of 19. His name was Tongji, but the court had long learned that names in the Forbidden City were fragile things, carrying the weight of empires and the curse of expectation. He had been born into a palace where the air was heavy with the sighs of dying dynasties, where every step he took as a child was shadowed by eunuchs, and where every lesson he learned was taught under the watchful gaze of the Empress Dowager, his mother, Cixi. Tongji had grown restless as he reached adulthood, chafing under the control of his mother, eager to prove himself as more than a boy emperor hidden behind protocol and ceremonies. But China was in chaos. Rebellions flared like wildfires. Famines turned fertile lands into graveyards, and Western powers carved out pieces of the empire, forcing treaties onto the Qing court with the cold certainty of gunboats and cannons. Tongji sought escape from the suffocating expectations and the constant watch of his mother. He slipped into the night, into the hidden pleasures of Beijing's brothels, seeking comfort in the arms of courtesans, trying to forget the weight of the Dragon Throne for a few brief hours. But in those nights of hidden pleasure, he found something else. Death. The official court reports claimed it was smallpox that took him, a disease that scarred the beautiful faces of courtesans and emperors alike, leaving pockmarked reminders of mortality. But the rumors whispered a different tale, that the young emperor had contracted syphilis from his escapades, his body rotting from the inside, while the court scrambled to hide the shame. Some said his cries could be heard through the painted screens, that the once proud son of heaven wept like a child as the disease consumed him. And others whispered darker rumors still. They claimed that Cixi, seeing her son slipping away from her control, seeing his desire to rule without her, had decided that the empire and her power could not endure his weakness. They said she ordered a cup of poisoned tea, ending his suffering, ending his defiance, and ensuring that the Dragon Throne would never be out of her grasp. At the funeral, Cixi wore mourning white, her face veiled, her tears hidden. She wept for her son, or so they said, but the tears of the Empress Dowager were as much for herself as for the boy she had birthed in a desperate grabber for power 2 decades before. She wept, and when she was done, she turned to the future with the same cold clarity that had guided her rise from concubine to ruler of China. With her son gone, the throne should have passed to the next in line, but Cixi had other plans. She chose her 3-year-old nephew, Guangxu, as the new emperor, a child too young to challenge her, too young to rule without her hand guiding every decree, every decision, every breath he would take as the son of heaven. The forbidden city adjusted to its new reality, ministers bowing before a toddler while glancing fearfully at the silk screen behind which the true ruler of China sat, hidden but omnipresent. Cixi, once again, ensured that power remained in her hands, sealed by the death of a son who had forgotten the unspoken rule of the forbidden city. Power was never shared. As China fractured under the weight of rebellion and foreign humiliation, the forbidden city remained a world apart. A place of red lacquered walls, gold, tipped roofs, and the scent of sandalwood rising from censers in the cold morning air. And at the heart of it all was Empress Dowager Cixi, draped in robes embroidered with dragons. Jade rings clicking against one, another as she moved through the echoing halls. The empire bleeding beyond the walls, while she lived in splendor. The people starved in the countryside. Famine stripped villages to skeletons, parents selling children for bowls of rice. Corpses left in the fields as reminders of nature's cruelty and the court's indifference. Bandits roamed freely. Rebellions sparked by hunger and rage turned provinces into killing fields. And the Western powers continued to squeeze China, forcing treaties that carved out concessions, draining silver, and stripping dignity from a dynasty already on its knees. But inside the forbidden city, Cixi's court was alive with lavish banquets, the clink of porcelain cups, the rustle of silk robes, and the soft laughter of eunuchs performing operas to entertain the Empress Dowager. The summer palace, rebuilt with funds meant for the navy, became her sanctuary, its marble boat floating uselessly on the lake, a symbol of her priorities as China's ships rotted in port. She loved the theatre, the elaborate Peking opera performances with their painted faces and haunting music. She loved jewelry, rings of jade and gold, necklaces that dripped down her chest like waterfalls of wealth. She loved gardens, spending hours strolling beneath willows, as eunuchs fanned her, the air heavy with the scent of peonies, while the empire suffocated under foreign boots. Foreign diplomats arrived to negotiate treaties, their eyes catching glimpses of the forbidden city's splendor, whispering of the woman who ruled behind screens while her people starved. They saw the marble walkways, the dragon-carved thrones, the endless processions of officials bowing. But they also saw the cracks beneath the gold, the rot beneath the jade, the empire's decay hidden behind the illusion of power. While the empire burned, the Empress Dowager redecorated. Cixi was not blind to the suffering beyond the walls, but she chose to maintain the illusion of imperial authority with grand displays, hoping that if the forbidden city remained a place of order and beauty, the chaos outside might one day be contained. But history is not kind to illusions, and the world was changing faster than she could control. In the twilight of the Qing dynasty, as China stumbled toward its collapse, the image of Cixi remained that of a ruler wrapped in silk, sitting upon a dragon throne, surrounded by the splendor of a world that was already gone, clinging to power as the old world burned around her. Because in the end, even in the face of collapse, the Empress Dowager would not loosen her grip. Not on her empire. Not on her legacy. Not on her power. By the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty was staggering under the weight of its own decay. China's humiliations at the hands of Western powers had exposed the empire's weakness, and the looming shadow of Japan's rapid modernization threatened to swallow the Middle Kingdom whole. Factories, railroads, and modern armies were remaking the world, and in Beijing, a young emperor named Guangxu believed China could still catch up. Guangxu, the boy Cixi had placed on the throne, had grown into a man with ideals, inspired by reformers who whispered of railways, constitutional governance, modern armies, and schools that could pull China into a new age. The empire, he believed, could still be saved if it could be reborn. In 1898, under the guidance of reform-minded scholars like Kang Yue, Guangxu launched what would be known as the 100 Days Reform, a desperate, feverish attempt to drag China from its feudal slumber. Imperial decrees flowed like water, demanding the modernization of the military, the overhauling of education, the end of corruption, the promotion of industry, and the creation of a modern bureaucracy. But in the Forbidden City, the Empress Dowager Cixi watched with cold eyes. To her, these reforms threatened the fragile balance of power she had spent decades preserving. They challenged the authority of the old guard, undermined the conservative officials who were her loyal allies, and risked sparking chaos in an empire already on the brink of collapse. Change is dangerous, Cixi believed, when the world you rule is built on tradition. She had tolerated Guangxu's attempts at independence, but now, as edicts flew that threatened to cut the old roots of power, she decided to act. Cixi moved with her signature precision, weaving alliances with conservative officials and military leaders who feared the reforms would sweep away their influence. She leveraged rumors, feeding fear that the emperor was planning to remove her and the old officials in a sweeping purge. In September 1898, after just over 100 days of reform, Cixi struck. Soldiers loyal to her surrounded the emperor's palace, cutting him off from his allies. The young emperor, once so confident in his plans to save China, found himself a prisoner in his own home. The sea palace on a lonely island within the Forbidden City, where guards ensured he would never again rule freely. The reformers who had guided Guangxu, idealistic men who dreamed of a modern China, were labeled traitors. The 6 gentlemen, leaders of the movement, were dragged to the execution grounds, their hands bound, their eyes lifted to the grey Beijing sky as the executioner's blade fell. Their blood soaked into the dust, a warning to all who believed China could change without Cixi's permission. And so, under the shadow of the Empress Dowager, the dream of a reformed China died before it could live. The emperor, alive but powerless, spent his days pacing the lonely pavilions, surrounded by water, guarded by men loyal to the woman who had once raised him as a child. but who now ensured his silence. Cixi reasserted her control with an iron hand, restoring the conservative order, halting the reforms, and ensuring that China's march toward modernization would be delayed yet again. The empire would continue to stumble forward, bleeding from its wounds, as the world moved on without it. Because in the Forbidden City, the future was not welcome unless it bowed before the past. As the new century dawned, the ground beneath China shook with the fury of a people pushed to the edge. Foreign powers had carved China into spheres of influence. Missionaries roamed the countryside preaching a faith that many Chinese saw as another tool of Western control, and railroads and telegraph lines cut through ancestral lands, symbols of humiliation and subjugation. In the dust-choked villages of North China, a movement was rising, a movement of peasants, martial artists, and mystics, calling themselves the Yiquan, the righteous and harmonious fists. To the west, they would be known as the Boxers. They believed they were invulnerable to bullets, that the spirits of their ancestors and the gods themselves would protect them as they rose against the foreign devils and the corrupt Qing officials who had sold China's dignity for silver. Their rebellion was a boiling, chaotic rage, a rejection of modernity, a scream of defiance from the forgotten poor. At first, Cixi ignored them, dismissing the Boxers as another band of peasants lost in superstition. But as the movement grew, burning churches, killing missionaries and Chinese Christians, and attacking foreign compounds, Cixi saw something else, an opportunity. She saw in the Boxers a weapon to strike back at the foreign powers who had humiliated China, a tide of rage that could be turned against the Westerners who dictated terms to the Qing court. She saw the Boxers as a last hope to reassert Chinese sovereignty. In June 1900, as the Boxers laid siege to the foreign legations in Beijing, Cixi declared war on the foreign powers, throwing the Qing dynasty's weight behind the peasant rebellion. Imperial banners were raised alongside Boxer flags, and the streets of Beijing turned into chaos, with foreign diplomats and their families barricaded in compounds, fighting for survival against the tide of fury outside their walls. It was a gamble born of desperation, and it failed. The foreign powers, 8 nations united by the threat to their citizens and interests, formed the 8-nation alliance. Soldiers from Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States, Japan, Italy, and Austria-Hungary marched on Beijing, their boots pounding the dusty roads, their cannons leveling city walls. They fought their way to Beijing, lifting the siege of the legations in August 1900, and the foreign armies poured into the Forbidden City, looting its treasures, defiling its sacred spaces, exacting brutal revenge for the deaths of their people. The air filled with the screams of the dying, the crack of gunfire, and the smoke of burning buildings. And Cixi, the Empress Dowager who had ruled China with an iron hand for decades, fled. Dressed as a peasant, hidden among her retinue, she abandoned the Forbidden City, leaving the imperial capital to the foreign armies. She rode in a mule cart through the dust of North China, the woman who once commanded emperors, now hiding from the wrath of the world she had tried to defy. Behind her, Beijing lay shattered, its people paying the price for her gamble, the dynasty humiliated yet again as foreign soldiers paraded through the heart of the Middle Kingdom. The Boxer Rebellion, which began as a cry of defiance, ended in disaster. China was forced to pay crushing indemnities, its sovereignty eroded further, its humiliation complete. And Cixi, who had once believed she could bend the world to her will, returned to the Forbidden City, her power intact but her empire weaker than ever. The dynasty she fought to preserve now, a ghost walking toward its grave. Cixi returned to Beijing in 1902, 4 years after fleeing the Forbidden City in the wake of the Boxer Rebellion, her empire humiliated, her people impoverished, her throne secured only by the iron will that had defined her life. The Forbidden City was not as she had left it. Foreign soldiers had marched through its sacred gates, looting its treasures, mocking its grandeur. Dust and ashes still lingered in corners where fires had been set. The painted dragons above the throne room seeming to leer down with cracked, faded eyes. The empire had been forced to sign treaties dripping with humiliation, paying vast reparations to the eight-nation alliance, its silver reserves drained, its sovereignty shattered. Cixi, the woman who had once believed she could control the tides of history, now faced an empire rotting from the inside, an emperor she had imprisoned, and a people who were beginning to whisper of revolution. Yet she clung to power with the same relentless ferocity that had brought her from a teenage concubine to the ruler of China. She began to speak of reform. Not the sweeping modernization that Guangxu had once dreamed of, but carefully measured changes, always under her watchful eye. She established new schools that taught Western sciences and languages, ordered the restructuring of the military with modern weapons, and even began to discuss the idea of a constitutional monarchy. But the world outside the Forbidden City was changing faster than her careful, conditional reforms could contain. The Qing dynasty was a dying beast, bloated with corruption, paralyzed by fear, and mocked by foreign powers who saw its weakness as opportunity. The people were restless. Secret societies whispered of revolution. Newspapers, smuggled into China and read in the tea houses and alleys, spoke of the fall of dynasties and the dawn of republics. Cixi's health began to fail in these final years. The woman who had once ridden through the dust of North China, disguised as a peasant now, found herself confined to her chambers. Her feet bound, her body frail, her breath rattling in her chest at night, as she lay awake in the darkness, surrounded by the silent shadows of her eunuchs. Yet, even as her body weakened, her mind remained sharp. She ruled from her bed, issuing edicts, receiving ministers, and keeping her fragile empire together through the sheer force of her will. She watched the boy she had made emperor, Guangxu, now a grown man, but still a prisoner in the sea palace, pacing behind locked gates, a reminder that the Empress Dowager's power was absolute, even as the world outside slipped beyond her grasp. In the final months of her life, Cixi saw the signs of collapse everywhere. The Qing military was weak and corrupt, unable to defend its borders. The treasury was empty, drained by wars and reparations. The people were rising, protests and strikes flaring across the provinces like sparks in a dry forest, waiting for a wind to become a fire. And in the Forbidden City, Cixi, old and dying, prepared for the end. On November 14, 1908, the Guangxu emperor died, his life extinguished within the same Forbidden City that had been his gilded prison for a decade. The official cause was reported as illness, but the court whispers told a different tale: a sudden, suspicious death, a final act of silencing by the Empress Dowager, who had once raised him, then caged him, then erased him when he became a threat. Some say his face was blackened at death, a sign of poison, a silencing to ensure that, in the days after Cixi's death, there would be no return to the reforms she had crushed. The Empress Dowager, even in her final days, would not allow the empire she had built to slip from her vision of order. One day later, on November 15, 1908, Empress Dowager Cixi died. The woman who had ruled China for nearly half a century, who had survived coups, rebellions, wars, and foreign invasions, who had outlived emperors and executed enemies, who had clung to power with a hand iron and silk, finally closed her eyes. They prepared her body with the rituals befitting the Empress Dowager. Her hair was combed, her face painted, her body dressed in robes of yellow silk embroidered with dragons. Jade rings slipped onto lifeless fingers, a final image of the power she had wielded so fiercely. Outside, the empire trembled. Within 4 years, the Qing dynasty would collapse, the last emperor, Puyi, a child on the dragon throne, forced to abdicate as revolutions swept through China, ending 2,000 years of imperial rule. The Forbidden City would become a relic, its treasures looted, its walls hollow echoes of a fallen world, and Cixi's legacy would become a battlefield for historians. To some, she was the Dragon Lady, a tyrant who had strangled China's future in the name of her own power, crushing reforms, executing visionaries, and dooming her nation to humiliation and collapse. A woman whose luxury and paranoia blinded her to the suffering of her people, whose vanity and cruelty marked the final chapters of imperial China in blood. To others, she was a cunning survivor, a woman who had navigated a corrupt, decaying court, foreign invasions, and rebellion to keep the empire intact for as long as she could, holding the pieces of a broken dynasty together with the only methods available in a brutal world. A ruler who understood that power was survival, and that survival required strength, fear, and relentless will. History is dark, and we must remember it. Cixi's story is the story of the Forbidden City itself, beautiful, cruel, elegant, and tragic. A place of silk screens hiding whispered executions, of jade bracelets clinking softly while treaties were signed in blood, of golden dragons watching as the empire they guarded crumbled beneath them. The Empress Dowager died, but the shadows she cast remained. In the end, power is never truly owned. It is only borrowed from history, paid for in blood, fear, and silence. And Cixi paid, in full, until her last breath.